because of the IMF targets, there is a distinct focus on the fiscal equation. But I wonder if, because of our external debt issue, shouldn't there be just as much focus on the trade deficit? So I wonder if you can just comment on that, on this, within the context of the fiscal management issue.
I think I would want to say something that Dr. Ahluwalia said. Sri Lanka is a small country, and the numbers certainly look big for us in the context. But I look at it like this. I think that it's a small country and it could be fixed. Fixing the trade issue is not by restriction. I'm completely with what Dr. Ahluwalia and Mr. Krishna Kumar said, is that we have to open out. We have to open out. You know, all these restrictions that we have put on imports, particularly in terms of production, these things have to go. You know, when they did this in India, one of the lessons there was that there was opposition, and he hinted at that. You know, there were some industries got together, they formed a club, and you know, they were saying opening up will cause problems, and you know, arguing the case of protection and things. I think we had to break out of that mindset, basically. We have ticked all the IMF boxes at the moment, but we have ticked it at tremendous cost. Some of the cost is what the leader of the opposition just said. One was that the poverty rates have really shot up. Small and medium industries, lakhs of those have actually closed down. So it has come at a cost. The boxes have been ticked. I think we have to get into the growth phase. And therefore, I think there are lots of opportunities. We have said global slowdown, but the South Asian story is different. Understand the trends that are there, use the trends to go this route. Lots of examples I can give. You know, we looked at tourism. We have for decades said there's a season in tourism because our tourists were mainly coming from Europe and coming from the US. This country can be a 365-day tourist destination. If Asia is growing, why not? We have to really look at this, you know, and we have to be very hopeful. We are not negative about this. The situation is bad, but we have to go this route. I would just say one thing that both the speakers didn't touch on, which I saw as a difference between India and us. One day, Dr. Ahluwalia was in a meeting and the Prime Minister was there. And then somebody said, you know, but continuity of policy is a problem, right? This is a question I hear often from business people. They say governments change, policies change, tax policies change, export policies change, so many things change, and that's why Sri Lanka can't really sustain development. And the answer the Prime Minister gave, he said, well, I am changed, and then pointed to Dr. Ahluwalia and said, right, that is no change, it continues. My point here is, Sri Lanka and India, the difference is we don't have an independent public sector. Us as a party, we are looking very closely at that because we think Sri Lanka needs an independent public sector so that there could be policy continuation.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have one of the hot topics in the country right now is regarding the IMF program and whether there is space to renegotiate any aspect of this IMF program. So before I come to the other members of parliament on stage, I'd like to come back to Dr. Ahluwalia and then shift to Dr. Nishan Dimel. Dr. Ahluwalia, can you give us your experience of IMF programs and renegotiating IMF programs? What do you understand by renegotiating as well? So if you could give us a little bit of ideas on that.
Well, fortunately, we never had to renegotiate a program, though that very often happens. So if you're in our case, we were in fact originally thinking in '91 that we would need a second program because we thought that the first one would finish by the end of '93, and then we would need a second program. And we were fortunate, we were lucky, the world economy was doing well, and we got a lot of response to our initial steps. And this confidence was restored, basically. And we had to tell the IMF that, look, thanks very much for discussing with us a possible second program, but we don't need it. So we didn't have that problem. But I think the critical thing, in case you need a second program, remember, we never had a debt servicing problem. So, you know, we didn't have to restructure. You're restructuring your debt, and there's an assumption that the external environment will improve sufficiently that when the repayment of the restructured debt begins, you'll be able to make that payment. Now, there have been cases in the past, for example, Greece, which, you know, they just weren't able to do it. So if you have to renegotiate the program, I mean, that's what the IMF is for, and they pay quite a lot. So they realize, but you know, at the time when you have to go for renegotiation, they have to be able to say that, well, Sri Lanka did what it was possible to do. So I think if you end up simply saying that, look, we can't do any of these things we promised, and therefore let's start again, there won't be much support from the staff. Now, you may be able politically at a higher level to get the staff also to change, but that's where, I mean, in a way, smaller countries have less leverage. Bigger countries have more leverage. So I think the strategy to follow is to make sure that 2 years from now, in case you need more assistance, both the IMF and the World Bank were able to say, well, you know, Sri Lanka has made a really good set of progress in what they promised. I think you'll find that these organizations are there to lend money. So they're not there not to lend money. So if they can make a reasonable case that yes, reforms are taking place, they would be quite realistic. You know, any assumption about whether a particular program is good enough is based on arbitrary assumptions about what's going to happen in the world. I mean, if the world trade doesn't grow the way the IMF expected, that'll be a very good reason for Sri Lanka to say, look, we just need more time. And you know, this whole issue, I'm now stepping a little back, I think there's a lot of sympathy, and there should be, on the part of countries, or rather people, that when a country is pushed into default, it's not just the problem of the country, it's also the weakness of the lenders. I mean, when a company goes into default, I mean, the lenders lose their money. Here, what is happening is it's being assumed that somehow we'll be able to help the country to repay all its debt by restructuring it, and there's not enough of a haircut. And that is an issue that has been before the international community for quite some time. And the only haircuts that take place are when the lenders collectively agree. And generally when they are well disposed, they recognize it at the official level. But if you have a lot of debt to the private sector, those fellows don't. Because they realize that, you know, you have a lot as it were to lose, and their strategy would be to say, there's no case for you know, a haircut on private loans or bonds, let the official fellows do more. Well, you don't care who does it. But I think it raises the question, any assumption of debt restructuring is based on a reason, on it being enough, is based on some assumption about how much the country can do if it follows the right policies. And if it follows those policies more or less, and is not in a position, then in retrospect, there should have been a bigger haircut. Now, you may not actually get the private sector to agree to a haircut, but then the IMF can be made to restructure and give you more time. That's really, this is a big weakness in the international monetary system. And since 2001, it's been argued that we need an agreement on how to handle debt restructuring, and they've not been able to reach an agreement.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aluwal. That's very interesting. So I'd like to just pose that to Dr. Nishant. So if I understand correctly, what he means is before renegotiating, we have to show the IMF that we have been able to perform along with the parameters provided, that we've met the targets, etc. And while commenting on that, could you also just comment on what Dr. Ahluwalia mentioned regarding the debt restructuring, and we have to go back regarding that agreement as well, Dr. Nishan.
Thank you, Kusume. So this is going to be a slightly longer answer. I'll start by responding to Iran to say not just an independent public service, but a professional public service. This is a critical factor. You can't have a public service that is less competent than the IMF, than the private sector, and expect it to succeed for your country. So we have to invest in building the best possible public service we can get. And we had a relatively good public service in the past. I'll tell you why, with an anecdote that connects to the IMF. A friend of mine was on the IMF team that went into South Korea when the East Asian crisis happened in the 97-98. You know, that was one of the fastest debt restructurings you ever saw in a country, and South Korea never looked back and went ahead. My friend says when they arrived at the Ministry of Finance, off the plane, first arrival of the IMF team, the South Korean bureaucrats put on the table a program, fully designed, in the formats, written in the formats used by the IMF, with all the templates in place, the strategies in place, the targets, and the outcomes described, and said, you don't need to do anything, we've designed our own program, and we can go ahead. Within 2 weeks, it went to IMF board for approval, and IMF program started. Because the bureaucrats didn't ask the IMF to design their economic strategy. You don't ask, I mean, lots of private sector here, which one of you asks your banker to write your business plan? And if you did, your banker should really be worried, right? You need to write your business plan, you need to know your strategy, and you need to convince the IMF, of course, that acts like an umpire, just like a banker says, look, I will fund this, I will give you this loan because I think it's a strong business plan. Sri Lanka needs the capability to do that, and when we do that, I think we get a better plan in place. Because poor IMF guys, there's so much about Sri Lanka they don't understand. Just like the banker, they're not going to write you a good enough business plan most of the time. On the renegotiation question, I will break it up in this way, and currently it's a little more complicated for Sri Lanka because we have two sets of targets and two sets of methods in play. One is a target for debt restructuring, the other is a target for fiscal targets. So two sets, fiscal targets, debt restructuring targets. You have two sets of methods. You have fiscal methods, that the method is not the same as the target, it's very important to understand that. And then you have governance methods, because the IMF and most of civil society in Sri Lanka, and I trust business too, understands full well that Sri Lanka doesn't simply fail because it doesn't have all the right economic policies or actions, but also because governance is hopelessly compromising the ability to get the economy on the right path. Governance is a foundation, and if you build on the sand without the foundation, your house comes tumbling down, you go to the IMF for the 17th time. So two sets of methods, two sets of targets, and I think where you can and can't negotiate works like this. After you have sat and worked with the IMF to come up with the targets, and you designed a program, it's hard to renegotiate the targets because a lot of time and effort has been spent, and there's a negotiation involved in doing that, but after that's done, that's often considered done. But the methods to achieve those targets get renegotiated all the time. Every 6 months, in fact, when there's a disbursement, you will see, even in Sri Lanka, that the program changes quite a bit. Now, it's happened in the last 2 years. We had, for instance, initially a method of having a 15% VAT. That got renegotiated by the IMF to an 18% VAT. Sri Lanka agreed to automatically index excise taxation that applies to tobacco, alcohol, and things like that. Somehow Sri Lanka renegotiated and removed the indexation on excise taxation and said we don't want to do it. There was property taxes in the program, and that got renegotiated to an imputed rental income tax. So I can keep going. There was the idea that Sri Lanka will take away, remove, and not have discretion in giving tax exemptions. As you know, that tax exemptions and concessions counted in, according to the government, about 50% of revenue was lost in tax exemptions and concessions. And IMF said, look, here's a method for governance. You don't give discretion to your ministers in giving tax exemptions. In this last review, Sri Lanka renegotiated and said, no, we are going to keep that discretion. So I can keep going, but the program, the methods have to get renegotiated, sometimes for the interests of the country, and sometimes for vested interests. But because you may want to be learning all the time and figuring out what is the best method to get to the target. So I think we have to separate out these two things. Now, if you find, as Montek says, as you go along, that maybe you set the targets incorrectly. Maybe you agreed to too little debt restructuring. That's a more serious renegotiation. And perhaps it needs to be done for the sake of long-term sustainability, but it can only be done on the basis of good analysis that you put on the table. And for instance, Sri Lanka would have to ask for a new debt sustainability analysis if it wanted to renegotiate the targets. And then on the basis of a professionally done newer debt sustainability analysis, discuss whether the targets need to be amended. It can't be done on whim. And the methods must also be subject to, that's why I said professional bureaucracy, professional analysis to say, when we set these methods, we're going to hit the targets. Now, Sri Lanka has had a weakness in that. Last year, Sri Lanka said, here's the revenue we are going to make in 2023. I know some of you all were at our public finance lounge. 1 month after the budget in December 2022, we said this target, just do the math, it's going to be missed by 11% or 12%. We settled on 12 a month later. The target was missed by 13%. Government thought they were going to miss it by 17 when they put this year's budget. What I'm saying is that target wasn't missed because some unforeseen thing happened. Just the simple math that we were doing, we were able to predict or project that the target's going to be missed. But we continued with a method that was going to not succeed. And then we didn't succeed. And then you got to come up and increase VAT and do all kinds of other things now to see how do you get at the target. So having really a professional, analytically driven set of policies that can achieve the targets and making sure the targets are written not by your banker, but by a professional bureaucracy, and if necessary, as Montek says, renegotiated to make sure that this is going to deliver long-term sustainability of the country. I think that's the way to go. So renegotiation should not be considered some kind of crime. I mean, it is the way to optimize, okay? Because it's like, I'll end with this. If you're going to get on a journey, you might roughly know where you want to get to, but as you're moving, you don't get into Gall Road and put your car on cruise control. You've got to be, it's a dynamic process. You're constantly alert and adjusting to the traffic, adjusting to what is happening on the road, and making sure that you are finding the best routes and best paths to get to where you're going. And driving an economy is like that. You don't just agree to some programs, some methods one time, and then close your eyes and just keep implementing it. You've got to be adjusting to what's going on, how it is working out, what new information you're getting, and optimizing the program all the time. So I would say renegotiation thought like that is a really positive thing, and we should look at it in that way.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nishan. Dr. Alwal, you want to come back on that?
I just want to pitch in because as the discussion went on, there's one aspect of our experience that I want to share. When we negotiated the 91 agreement, we had already depreciated the rupee by 24% in 2 stages. So the IMF wasn't actually looking for anything else on the exchange rate. But internally, we had made up our minds that we were actually going to go to a market-determined, fully flexible exchange rate in 2 steps. First, a dual exchange rate, and then a fully flexible one. Now, since there was no such thing in the program, when I consulted with the IMF guys, I said, look, we're going to do it this way. It's not part of our program, but you will agree that moving to a fully flexible exchange is a good thing. They were, of course, delighted. But I said, we're going to do it in 2 steps. First, a sort of a dual exchange rate, and very quickly thereafter unify. And so there was a consultation with the IMF. They felt that we were sharing with them our intention, and they also felt that we were doing more than what the program required, which they were pleased about. That's why I would say that, you know, in your case, there are some things that you're going to do which you believe you need to do anyway, okay? In order, if you need to do a renegotiation, it's a good idea to build goodwill by doing more in this area to begin with. I mean, the best area in my view would be reducing duties and making the exchange rate flexible. I mean, that goes down very well in the contemporary notion that the country wants to become open, it's lowering duties, it's adopting a flexible exchange rate. And that also helps remittances. Because, you know, people who are remitting money get a better deal if the exchange rate is more flexible.
Thank you, sir. May I come to Honorable Sujiva Singh, and since Dr. Nishan mentioned the fiscal targets that we've been given. So fiscal targets means that everybody here has to pay higher taxes. So from a political as well as the economic angle, Sri Lanka has to reach tax to GDP of around 15% according to the IMF. 15% tax to GDP seems a little low for a country like Sri Lanka. I think India has something closer to 20%. But at the same time, the Sri Lankan people are already heavily burdened with VAT, income taxes, etc. And I think the Sri Lankan population that's not really used to having such a robust tax system either. So can you discuss this issue of the impact on people's lives of this higher taxes, but also the necessity to improve our tax to GDP ratio?
Yeah, when we spoke to the IMF, what we learned, they are willing to listen to us. And our tax to GDP is about 13% at the moment. So what we told them is we can't give the goose and we can't expect to raise taxes and get taxes from them, especially the business community and the exporters. So what we told them, we can expand the tax web. It's about 1 million taxpayers in the country at the moment, and I believe that we increased up to about 1.7 million during our government, and it came back to about 1 million. So by introducing technology and new methods, we can expand the tax web and take it up to about 2 million taxpayers. With that, we can increase up to about $4 billion we can have extra without burdening the businessman, without kind of killing the businessman. So the IMF actually agreed with us. I said if we raise taxes on exporters and if we discourage them, they might move into other markets like India and Bangladesh. So they understood our concerns. So what we told them was, renegotiating definitely about 4 months ago when we were discussing, we anticipated a haircut of about 35%. And when we calculated, it came from the external debt from about 42 billion to about 25 billion. So we were very optimistic that the external debt, it would come down to 25 billion, but the government didn't negotiate on that. They concentrated more on the election, so they kind of missed out on the opportunity. So we'll have to aggressively work on a haircut for sure, because 45 billion it will increase. Another 3 years time, it will accumulate, the interest will accumulate, and it will be over 50 billion. So I think that's a bit of a off target for us. If we aggressively talk to them, what I understood when you talk to IMF, they are willing to negotiate, but they are not going to put words in our mouth. We have to talk to them and we have to push them and say that this is, because we have to, end of the day, we have to pay the debt. So as the doctor said, for us to pay the debt, we have to first survive. And if we don't get our economy right, they know that we can't pay anything. So for us to pay something, they know if you negotiate properly, they know that by helping us. But what happens is if you don't negotiate, if you don't push them, they will just merely, they are bankers, their economists will put a system. that system, what happened with the government, they just took the system, and I believe the president didn't concentrate much on that because his focus was on the election. So we missed out on a golden opportunity to get a haircut because most of the countries, Zimbabwe got about 35% haircut. Another country got about, I think about, I forget the country, about 28%. So we missed out on that golden opportunity when we are struggling. But now what happens is now they think we are normal, we have come to normalcy. So they will be now reluctant to give a haircut on us, thinking that we are getting stable. But actually, we are not there yet. So again, we have to tell them we are barely kind of surviving, but you need to help us for us to pay the debt. You have to help us because it was only China, I believe, was not coming into the table and kind of agreeing for the haircut. So I think strongly as a government tell them that we have a transparent and a trustworthy government, zero tolerance of corruption as well. With that, with the policy, I think with proof that we'll do well in the future, we might be able to negotiate. That's the understanding I had when I spoke to them.
Thank you. Yes, Dr. Nishan, you want to comment on this?
Yeah, I just, because you said, we don't like paying higher taxes, and IMF wants us to raise tax to GDP, I want to come in to just point out that the way to raise tax to GDP is not by asking people to pay higher taxes, but by doing a better job at collecting the taxes from more people. So I think Sujiva said quite rightly that the number of tax files today is significantly less than what they were in 2019. India has had similar, and actually South Asia on average, Verite research shows, has had similar rates of corporate taxes, but collected twice as much in tax to GDP from corporates as Sri Lanka, because we are busy perhaps giving lots and lots of tax holidays and concessions or not appropriately collecting. So while Sri Lanka collects 1.2% of GDP from corporates, India collects maybe 2.4% of GDP with the same tax rates. India with state and central tax collection gets about 19% of GDP in taxes. And it's a poorer country. So if India, being a poorer country with similar or lower tax rates, can collect almost 20% of GDP in taxes, that's not a high target for Sri Lanka. It's just about how you do it. And the fact that you collect it, not that you keep increasing the tax rate on the few that are paying it. That's a bad idea. And we've come up with methods like having withholding tax, which is an easy way to collect from a large number, and having a proper system to refund that tax if people have too much has been collected from them. So there are lots of methods to do it. We just need to come back to Iran's point of a professional administration that you focus on, getting the job done properly. Otherwise, I think there will be a resistance to increasing the taxes, as you say.
And I think the individual's spending is not monitored also properly in Sri Lanka. So if you have a system like a QR code, when you go abroad, that is entered. When you spend in some other place, that is entered. When you buy a car, because it's not monitored in Sri Lanka properly. So it's easy to get away from the tax web. So we have to use technology and make sure that everybody is in it.
Thank you, sir. And may I now bring in Honourable Member of Parliament Harshan Rajakaruna. We've just been talking about taxation, and everybody here understands that we are all paying more tax today than we did a year ago, and we will be probably paying a little more tax in a few months' time. But Mr. Rajakaruna, if you can just tell us, you spend a lot of time in the grassroots in Sri Lanka, and you understand the concerns of people. A lot of questions I've received today also pertain to this point that even though the public are paying more and more taxes, there seems to be very little action from the government regarding corruption, regarding reducing their expenditure, regarding rationalizing themselves. So how do you view this dynamic? Because it seems that the people are being asked to make significant sacrifices. Are we seeing those same sacrifices and hard decisions taken by the government to benefit the people?
I think as all of us agree, the biggest problem is, or one of the biggest problems is corruption. So to eliminate corruption, the willingness, political willingness to eliminate corruption is the most important thing. It's just not one thing, but you have to have that political willingness. And we have not seen in the previous, even in the incumbent government, that it's happening. I mean, they say, okay, we are going to bring this act or few other acts. But when you have formed a government with the most corrupt people in parliament, I don't think people will believe that it will ever happen. So political willingness is number one. And I believe the SJB leader is willing to take that action. And also, we have to have these independent institutions, just not the namesake independent. We have to have these independent institutions actually. For example, Attorney General's Department. Now, Attorney General's Department there's a conflict of interest. They are representing the government and even the president. So we have to have not only that, we have to have independent prosecution system where it is not politically influenced. And also these other independent institutions, for example, bribery, police commission and so on, they have to have that independence, and for all of that, it's a political willingness. If you appoint your closest associates for these positions, we will never get this result. So, like I said, political willingness will be the key reason.
Thank you very much, sir. May I bring in the leader of the opposition on that track? Because I think the IMF released its first ever governance diagnostic report, one of the first for Sri Lanka, the diagnostic report. The report itself pointed out several threats to governance. One of them was that the president holding the portfolio of the Minister of Finance is a huge threat to governance and to our governance system. And even at the point of the IMF publishing this report, Sri Lanka's president was holding the portfolio of the Minister of Finance. So, and we also, Dr. Aluwali talks about political will. So I'd like you to put these two things together in a future SJP government. For example, if you were the president, would you also hold the Minister of Finance, that portfolio? Do you think that is a good way to go forward? And what do you think about this idea of having political will, more than even the technical knowledge, having the political will to bring in reform? So would you mind touching on those two things, sir?
I think as far as appointments are concerned, the prerogative of making the appointments, we should follow the Constitution. The Constitution provides for the various provisions, through the various provisions, as to how the appointment process can take place. I don't think it's necessary for us to obtain advice from any other source with regard to making appointments as far as the Sri Lankan government is concerned. But what is most important is that we make those appointments in a justifiable manner. The appointments should be justiciable and justifiable. We should be able to answer to the people. So we need to appoint people with knowledge, qualification, experience, knowledge of the subject matter, proficiency. So there are a variety of benchmarks that we will adopt when it comes to making appointments. I also believe that we should look at the anti-corruption programs, measures, from a different perspective. The various legislation that are in place right now, promoting measures to stifle corrupt activities, I personally think that those institutions, in order to guard their independence, I would say it's very important to enshrine those anti-corruption institutions and the various other tools and instruments and measures in the Constitution itself as an entrenched clause, so that those who are involved in the promotion of anti-corrupt activities and measures, that they are truly independent. When anti-corruption institutions are standalone institutions and they're guaranteed by entrenched provisions in the Constitution, you're less susceptible to change. Now, acts of parliament you can change. You only need the simple majority. Of course, in exceptional circumstances, you may need a 2/3 plus a referendum. But I think the anti-corruption institutions must be safeguarded. The personnel involved in carrying out the duties, their independence, must be protected by providing them with the security of an entrenched clause in the Constitution which cannot be easily changed. Something akin to fundamental rights, so that as governments change, they may decide to change the requisite legislation. Now that can happen if these anti-corruption institutions and the relevant stipulated clauses are enshrined and protected as an entrenched clause in the Constitution.
Thank you very much, sir.